Hey everyone, looks like we're live. Welcome back to another session of ABC of Contemporary Capital. We're almost done with the course, so please keep tuning in, putting questions into the chat. I wanted to share a session that we have going on with the International People's Assembly, our third and final session of our NATO versus peace course, which is on US imperialism and on the war in Ukraine. This one, the topic will be what are the conditions for peace? And we'll be hearing from Ben Becker of the Party for Socialism and Liberation of the US, and also from Akel Takaz of the World Peace Council of Palestine. So you can tune in on YouTube, and I'll put that link into the chat. And for those of us here in the Zoom, I can also share that as well. And with that, I'll pass it over to David to get us started. Thanks.
Okay. So welcome back, everyone. And this week's stuff is very difficult for a couple of reasons. Firstly, given all of the horrible images and things coming out of Ukraine, it's very hard to sort of sit around and try and concentrate on rather abstract concepts and theoretical kind of ideas, and you kind of want to know what can anybody do practically, but it is something I never imagined we would see again. But it's really truly appalling, and I think we have to find some way to collectively express it. And of course, the subtext that's making things even more appalling is Orban's re-election in Hungary with a very, very much stronger majority. Very nerve-wracking signs in France that Le Pen is suddenly gaining very strongly in stature. And so you kind of look at it and you kind of say, well, you would have thought that the response to what we're seeing would be to kind of go off in some more humane direction, but it seems that there's a real political twist going on, which is sort of favoring the autocratic, authoritarian, neo-fascist ways of thinking and behaving as we've been seeing from all of these images. So this is a very difficult time to sort of talk about, as I say, talk about abstract concepts, but nevertheless, we'll do what I normally do, which is to sort of say, well, I hope you had a chance to read the text. Last week's text, and even more so this week's texts, are tentative. I'm not happy with them in the sense that I got it all sorted. Not at all. I think quite a bit more work needs to be done. But I thought it would be very interesting to get at least some ideas down to see how they look and see what makes sense from them. And this week is about the circulation of interest-bearing capital and the rise of finance. And I had a certain technique, and I wanted to explain this. I've been doing this in these sessions as I go on, sometimes talking about Marx's technique and trying in some ways to keep within the framework of that technique in terms of our own investigations. And one of the things I haven't mentioned, but which is, I think, very much the case on last week's readings, is that Marx tends to say he looks at things through, again, a double movement. And he uses this notion of a double movement explicitly about, what he can tell from concepts as they are, and then concepts in relationship to the totality, which is sort of a second go. But in this case, the double movement is between what he called the method of descent and the method of ascent. And he made the point in Capital, one of the introductions to Capital, his mode of procedure was to start with looking at the reality around him, the things actually on the surface of society that he was seeing, and interrogating them very carefully, and sort of dissecting them and trying to find out what it is lay within them, on the thesis that, as he said somewhere, that if everything was as it appeared to be on the surface, there would be no need for science. But he clearly saw a need for science, which was to find what are the underlying concepts which drive the surface reality. But you start with the surface reality. And then he said you do the method of descent, which is the method of dissection, partitioning, and you end up through the method of descent, arriving at a certain point where you start laying out certain abstract concepts, like value and fixed capital and so on. And so you then start to put those fixed capital and value and interest-bearing capital and so on, you start to put them together as the basic concepts, which when they're brought into interaction, you can take back up to the surface and have a different reading of the reality that you see there. In other words, you started with a kind of a naive understanding of that reality. You found out what was going on inside and below, and then you sort of brought that back up to the surface and said, well, this explains what's going on the surface in a far more profound form than we were able to do when we simply described what was going on the surface. So in this first section on really on finance, capital and credit and all the rest of it, I did lay out some surface examples, and I tried to do it in a way which did indicate some of the elements of the sorts of theoretical apparatus that might make sense in relationship to them, before then going into sort of talking about, well, okay, how do we construct, as it were, a theory of finance capital? And one of the big issues here is can you do it in a way which doesn't just sort of discard everything that's gone before? In other words, has there been a completely revolutionary transformation to make all of the stuff we've done in the preceding weeks irrelevant? Now, I'm sure you wouldn't like to sit in a course in week 10 and be told that everything that went before is irrelevant. So what it does, however, is to say that what we have done so far takes us so far into the theory of capital, but we now need to progress more deeply and more seriously into the circulation of interest-bearing capital, money capital, finance capital, and all the rest of it. And what that does is it doesn't abolish what's come before, but it allows us, when we reintegrate it all with the totality, to come to a better understanding of what was going in those weeks before. In particular, come to a better understanding, for example, of what value is about and what reach the value theory has, and in what ways we need to reconceptualize the idea of value when we start to look at the deployment of interest-bearing capital. So one of the things I've tried to do in the class is to sort of provide a link from one session to the next session. The link in this case, of course, is back to fixed capital and Marx's kind of commentary that it's only through understanding fixed capital that you can understand why interest-bearing capital is so important. So there is a link there, and particularly when you're dealing with fixed capital of an independent kind, and the built environment and the consumption fund and all those kinds of things, you really can't get into them. You have to get into them from what has gone before, but you can't get into them in the same way without actually theorizing and getting a better understanding of what is going on with interest-bearing and capital and the credit system. And by and large, the framing of these two sessions on finance capital looks something like this: that clearly the system we were looking at, when not only fixed capital but differential turnover times, all kinds of things of that sort, and temporalities and so on, we really couldn't deal with them without having a circulation of interest-bearing capital and credit system and all the rest of it to facilitate all those things which we've been talking about in the earlier sessions. So they are necessary features. And as necessary features, they have distinctive functions to perform. And one of the things we can do is to say, well, what functions does interest-bearing capital really perform in relationship to this inner structure of accumulation? The answer is, well, you know, it's rather complex to try and work out exactly what these functions are, particularly since Marx never did that other part of the double move where when I say, well, he goes off and he looks at finance capital in and of itself. He looks at interest-bearing capital in and of itself and discovers certain things about it. But he doesn't take the second move, which is to reintegrate it back into the totality. So he never comes back into us and says things like, well, we really need to advance our understanding of the value theory in certain ways because what we're encountering with the circulation of interest-bearing capital is something which raises the question of are we looking at monetary forms of value, or is that all there is? And if so, if there are money forms of value, how do those money forms of value relate to the theory of value which Marx set up much earlier? So I want to maintain a certain kind of idea about these methodological principles which are underlying what Marx does, and then sort of recognize that we're at a certain point of looking at interest-bearing capital, and the general thesis, if you want to call it that, is that, well, interest-bearing capital and its circulation by the credit system was a very important servant of the dynamics of accumulation. And at a certain point, it became a critical servant for the dynamics of accumulation. And in so doing, however, it started to go from being a servant to being the master. And Marx suggests the possibility that the financial structure, if you like, is a kind of central nervous system for the whole forms that exist of capital accumulation. And that, but what's more, it does a load of things, and he spells these out in the session that we're going to look at right now. He spells these out, and as sort of what interest-bearing capital can do. But like I say, he doesn't sort of then afterwards sort of survey it and then say, okay, how does this look when we put it back inside of the totality? So there's not much talk about the totality in the sections of Marx where he's dealing with finance capital and interest-bearing capital. There's not much talk of that because he's not thinking about that. But we have to think about it. And so one of the challenges we have is to kind of say, okay, if we were satisfied with what Marx had discovered about the nature of the surface appearance of finance capital and interest-bearing capital, if we're satisfied with that, how then can we somehow or other rewrite our understanding of the capitalist totality and what the capitalist totality is all about? And I'm going to try to talk further about that in today's lecture as well. So those are some of the issues which are raised here, but you may have some questions, and I hope that you do, that you might want to sort of raise, and so we can get into some discussion about that. So who wants to go? Who wants to say something? Who has some ideas they want to share? And like I say, this is not a definitive statement. This is a preliminary kind of draft of something which may, by the time I get through with it, probably change quite a lot. But there we are. That's how things go. So who's got some questions, got some ideas, got some comments? Do people find this modestly interesting, or was it so complicated as to kind of leave you on one side? Okay, anybody want to start?
I have just a general question about like what exactly a consumption fund is, because I've seen this term, and there was another comment someone else left. So maybe if you could kind of give us some answer to that. It's like a general question.
Well, we consume things on a daily basis, but there is, in a sense, a fixed capital of our consumption, like a house and a car and knives and forks and things like that. All of those things at one point were produced as commodities. And when you set up your kitchen, for example, you'll set up a lot of utensils, you have pots and pans and this kind of stuff. That's your consumption fund. It's the assets that you use to engage in daily consumption. And in exactly the same way that capital can't function without machinery and fixed capital and all the rest of it, so your consumption cannot function without having a fund of things which last. I don't know how long your pots and pans last and how often you break your crockery and things like that. But if you go into any household, there will be a fund of things which are going to aid in consumption. Does that help? And you can put a value on it. I mean, if you asked a valuer to come in and value the whole thing, they could probably put a value on it. As I mentioned, in Marx's day, the consumption fund for a working family was very, very primitive. But in our society, it's really, pretty extensive. And a lot of money is spent on it. You go into, people's kitchens and you see all kinds of gadgets around, juicers and squeezers and coffee grinders and, and the like. So Marx doesn't write very much about the consumption fund. Obviously, in his day, if there was a consumption fund, it would be the consumption fund of the bourgeoisie, which is all about luxuries and all the rest of it, which was significant. But in our day, the mass consumption fund is very important. And as I say about the definition of fixed capital, items that are in the consumption fund, like a sewing machine, for example, can be transformed from being in the consumption fund to being fixed capital. If somebody comes along and says, hey, I want that sewing machine, and we're going to put it together with all these other sewing machines and create a sweatshop and make things. So the consumption fund items are not always consumption fund. Same applies to, I mentioned the case of old cotton mill, which gets turned into condos. I mean, we see a lot of that around. You go to any of these old textile towns and you'll find these condos which are converted cotton factories. So it's gone from the fixed capital category to the consumption fund category. And like fixed capital, you can do some trading. I mean, if you wanted to sell some items in your consumption fund, you could. And you may have new items that you don't use, and so you sort of put them up for sale and put them in yard sale or something like that. Is that clear to everybody? So any other questions or observations?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Professor. Hi. I'll try to put this in the form of a question. I was interested in the reading, I'm interested in the relationship between accumulation and centralization and trying to understand that. And then you say, when you talk towards the close of the essay on page 14, it's interesting because you'd say, from the perspective of the totality, we see the rise of indebtedness. But then also, as you said in your opening sort of, to today's class, looking at a moment, looking at the surface, the rise of indebtedness is also a kind of observation that we can make as a starting point.
Yes.
And so I I guess what I'm sort of the stuff that the ideas that I was wrestling with and is the relationship between the circulation and recuperation of the value embodied in such fixed capital as factories and houses and schools and hospitals and roads and all that, how that the circulation the is of that, or the urge for that value to not just be static but to be recirculated is connected to the individual or the working class's indebtedness. And if these are sort of two circulatory systems that are kind of overlapping with each other, or if they're part of the same system or what have you.
Well, the idea of totality would say, yes, they are all embedded in the totality, but how they are embedded is important. The indebtedness of working people and the condition of debt peonage into which many people in the working population are reduced to that status. If you look back, you remember we talked about the circulation of labor capacity, and it had these 5 moments. There was the moment of social reproduction, the moment in the market, the moment in the workplace, and then there was a moment that said, it's the money moment. And then you went from the money moment to purchasing the commodities to going back in. So that's the circuit. Now, when we looked at that in terms of Marx's analysis, the money moment appeared, just a sort of almost a transit point, not terribly important. And when I presented it, and this wasn't conscious on my part, but when I presented it, I just kind of breezed past it and said, well, that's the moment when, they've got a bit of money in their pocket and they can do what they like. In other words, that moment was unproblematic in the circular. So, and this is what I might mean about rereading the initial formulation. Because when we start to look at indebtedness, particularly debt peonage of the working class, that moment where they're supposed to have money is it starts to become rather critical. So we now go back and we look at that circulation of labor capacity and look at that moment and say, wow, there's a lot going on there. In fact, one of the reasons why the workers may put up with lousy conditions and be forced to go back into lousy conditions in the labor process is because they're so indebted. Their monetary condition is such. So this is what I mean by this. And so the question of it says that actually a working population has 2 direct sources of oppression. The first is the wage, what Marx sometimes refers to as wage slavery, the fact that you've got to earn a wage in order to live. So that's one, and that's very clear. What is not so clear is the fact that in order to, they need to get into wages, not only to live, but to pay off their debts. And this is particularly true with student debt, obviously, So that there is a calculated moment, it seems to me, within capital accumulation of actually saying, indebtedness is not only something which people need in order to cope with life because they've got a medical emergency or something like that. So it's not only that, or they need a house and so they get a mortgage and so on. It's not only that. It's about the way in which they then have to reshape their lives and reshape their whole behaviors within that circulatory process to deal with debt peonage. And this also has something to do with political consciousness. There's some very interesting sort of studies out about how students who are loaded with debt, how politically activist are they? And what what the surveys tend to show is they're not activists at all. They're so busy paying off their debts that, and also they're not going to be activists in the workplace because they're not going to want to get fired. And when I have this slogan, which comes from the 1930s, that debt encumbered homeowners don't go on strike. And you can see, therefore, that the creation of policies which suggest that a respectable working class person will be a homeowner, will therefore be debt encumbered, will therefore not shake the system. So there's something systemic there when you start to look at all the possible relations within the totality. Now, how that also relates to the general accumulation process. Well, one of the things that Marx kind of says is that at a certain position, the mass of commodities is growing. There are problems of absorbing this mass of commodities. How is it going to be absorbed? Well, part of it is going to be absorbed by debt-fueled consumerism, but it's also going to be absorbed by the creation of something which Marx calls consumption capacity. So you ask the question, what's the consumption capacity in our society? How much can it consume? And I always thought there was this wonderful moment years ago when Marcos was thrown out of being the dictator of the Philippines. And somebody went into Imelda Marcos's, and I don't know, she had something like 2,000 pairs of shoes. You kind of say, well, but even with 2,000 pairs of shoes, there's a limit on the number of pairs of shoes she could get, but there is not a limit on money. That's why money starts to become so significant. That if you are in the spiral form, can you have a spiral form with consumption capacity that can absorb that spiral form if the only market is for shoes, for example, or whatever? And the answer is no. There's limits there when it comes to commodities. There's limits there in terms of production capacity and all the rest of it. But the one form of capital that is unlimited, and I should have made much more of this in the discussion, the one form which is unlimited is money, and it's the money form. Which means that that if you're going to have, the capital is locked into the spiral form, but it has acute barriers in terms of commodities. It has acute barriers in terms of production and consumption capacity, but it has no meaningful barrier when it comes to money. And it's amazing. I mean, when I was growing up, to speak of somebody as a millionaire was kind of, oh, wow, they're hugely rich. Nobody gives a flying fuck about millionaires anymore. It's billionaires and it's multi-billionaires, and everything, and that comes back also to this proposition about the falling rate of profit and rising mass. Which then gets back to the centralization. That a more centralized and put it this way, a larger corporation can produce more new jobs on a lower rate of growth than a small corporation with a high rate of growth. So that centralization means more mass. And the more mass you have, the lower your rate of profit has to be in relationship to your targets in terms of creating more mass. So again, that relates to the general laws of accumulation, and that then kind of says, well, how do we then, as it were, return to the original argument about consumer capacity? And with consumer capacity, it means that you've got to keep on manipulating somehow or other wants, needs, and desires in the population. So it would make sense. If you've got a picture, it'll be very interesting to do this with a picture. If you had a good picture of a working class kitchen in 1850, and you took a picture of a working class kitchen now, in the advanced capitalist countries, not in the slums of Brazil, but in the working, you would see the difference in consumption capacity. But you would also behind it, you would say to yourself, there's been a magical transformation in wants, needs, and desires, and a magical transformation in the idea of what a kitchen is, or what a kitchen should be. So and again, that relates back to this, expansionism and spiral form, which can only be satisfied in the money form, but then that rising money form leads to things like the complete redesign of the working class kitchen from 1850 to 2021 or 2022. So this is the way I would think of that. And again, what I'm doing here is trying to sort of say, okay, we know something about working class consumerism today. We know it's debt fueled, a lot of it. But now we know a little about why it's debt fueled and why it's so important that it fulfill those functions. And there's a danger here, of course, that when I say this, that people say, oh, you're just functionalist. Well, I'm not quite functionalist, but it does make sense to talk about functions. What are the functions of credit? Why is it when you go to the store, they'll say, pay in 12 months, zero, buy things on the never, never. I mean, I've known of people in Baltimore who would go into a store which had one of these kinds of arrangements, which said zero credit for 12 months. And they would buy something, I don't know, some very important item for, I don't know, let's say $50. And they'd go out on the street and they'd sell it for $25 right then and there because they needed the $25. This is not unknown, of course, in the drug communities, but it was also known by some people who were in desperate circumstances who needed food would do that. And it's a kind of so you're also you're also talking about ways of life, and you're talking about consumer capacity and what consumption capacity is really all about, and why that capacity must increase. Why is it that increasing the consumption capacity, large organizations are more effective at both of consuming than small organizations at the same rate of growth? Any other kind of questions?
Maybe. So we can see that there are some similarities in the way that financialization processes are functioning nowadays, and there are some more sophisticated forms. And I'm curious to hear what you think about cryptocurrency in all those financialization processes and their role.
Yeah, that's I'm trying to get at that in the subsequent lecture, and probably not to your satisfaction, because that's a very difficult. I mean, the financial system has become, highly complex in a way. And part of it has been technological innovation within, I mean, the fact that you can now pay with your phone, for example. This is the sort of thing that makes a real big difference. And we haven't seen the full effects of that yet. I'm terrified because I can't figure out how to do anything with my phone. So obviously that generation, which is X plus double X, which has a hard time with these kinds of things. When I was in China, the first year I was there, I paid in cash and everything was fine. The second year I was there, a lot of people were paying with their phone. The third year I'm there, I couldn't pay with cash anymore. There was no place that was taking cash. Everybody was paying with their phones, which turned out to be fine for me because I was a foreigner. I was always with somebody, and somebody else would have to pay because I couldn't pay. And I was with cash, and people would look. But of course, one of the things that happens there is that all your purchases can be tracked. And we saw something very, very interesting in the crisis in Cyprus, when suddenly they decided that everybody's bank account was going to lose 10% in order to get out of the difficulties. They were going to just simply, get rid of all the debt by everybody paying 10%. Apart from, guess whom? The ultra rich. You would have thought it'd been the other way around, because the ultra rich were Russian, and they were spending a lot of money in Cyprus, and the government was nervous about discouraging them by taking 10% of their assets, and the Russians were actually laundering money through Cyprus, and this was a very lucrative kind of thing. So when the government set it up, So there are techniques now of being able to follow the money in ways that, it was hard to do when you had cash. And it's going to be extremely interesting, I think, to see what happens if everything goes all phone as opposed to cash. How will the drug trade work? And how will the thousands of millions of dollars which get turned around through them, how will that work if you no longer can do it in cash? I mean, it's going to be a very interesting kind of moment when, for instance, the United States takes to all phone, but I doubt the United States will, because things are always different here about that sort of thing. The big issue is what kind of value theory can really work with the circulation of interest-bearing capital doing the things it does. I mean, if you are a money capitalist, as opposed to an industrialist capitalist, if you're a money capitalist, you're just simply interested in the highest profit you can make. Now, you can make a high profit by giving it to somebody who's in production, and the producer may say, okay, I'll give you 8% on what you lend me. But somebody who's engaging in land speculation, or somebody like George Soros, when he's doing all of his speculating against the British pound, who borrowed billions, he probably paid a pretty high rate of interest on it. But in a sense, that didn't matter, because it's only interest for a few days, about 10 days or something like that. But his access to the mass was such that he could do things that nobody else could do, which goes back to the question of the degree of centralization. And this then kind of says how do interbank relations work? Now there's an organization, I haven't really mentioned it, I should have mentioned it in here, which is the Bank of International Settlements. And connected to that is something called SWIFT, and you may have heard about SWIFT because that's being sanctioned. It's interesting. They use this thing about window. They use the language of windows. It used to be, back in the 19th century, when a bank would go to a window and present all the checks it had from other banks, and then would also get all the checks owed to them from other banks. So what would then be done is the clearinghouse would then sort of calculate everything and then end up saying, actually, you have to pay zero because the value of the checks coming into you is equal to the value of the checks going out. On a given day, that'd be very unlikely, but it could happen on a given day. But the net you owe is this much. So you would, at the end of the day, you might have 20 million worth of checks. But at the end of the day, you only have to pay $100,000 net to somebody or other in order to settle the account. So these things are called clearinghouses, and there were windows, and the banks had clearinghouses. Well, guess what? The banks increasingly are dispensing with clearinghouses. They're disappearing. Why? Because the banks are now setting up cryptocurrencies only for the banks. That is, there's a consortium of banks, and it has its own cryptocurrency, so that every transaction is immediately recorded and immediately, so that you would know where you are during the day, at the end of the day, this kind of stuff. And you can do that in ways where you used to have to go to the window physically, then you would go with electronically with sending it in by email kind of thing. And now you can do it by cryptocurrency through the banks. So this then says, well, the interesting thing is, can somebody hack that cryptocurrency? And the answer is it's really, really defended, as you can imagine. But you can't get into it. I can't get into it. Only the banks can get into it. So the big banks have these cryptocurrency clearing relations, which are automatic, and it's all done by artificial intelligence now, and it's all done through this automatic system, which means that there's no purpose of the clearing banks anymore. There used to be clearing banks who their only business was clearing the checks between banks, but they've been set out of business. Now, the Bank of International Settlements does this for banks in all nations. And the technical side of it is the SWIFT system, which is actually in Brussels as opposed to it being in Basel. So the Bank of International Settlements is connected to the SWIFT system. And what this does is to accelerate the capacity to settle debts. And they're automatically settled. Now, think of that and think of the situation in, say, the 19th century when you're in the city of London and you've got a draft on a bank from Königsberg or a bank from Seville or something like that. And you literally have a runner who trots off to the bank with these checks and deposits them and all this kind of stuff. And then maybe at the end of the day, we'll get a check back of what's owed to them from other banks. This was a very cumbersome, labor-intensive, rather insecure system. And there's therefore been an evolution in the transaction costs And one of the things that capital is very, very, very much attached to is the reduction of transaction costs. And the transaction costs in the financial sector remain fairly constant over different periods. It started to pick up with the internet and so on, but now it's moving very, very rapidly. So that transaction costs now are reduced to almost zero. So when I send money to Argentina, okay, so suppose I spend $5,000 to Argentina to family there. The bank would charge me something like $40 or $45, sometimes $50 for the transaction. If I had Bitcoin, it would cost me nothing. So organizations now are getting it together and setting up a Bitcoin transaction. So you go on financial pages of Financial Times and you'll see ads saying, do you want to send money to Argentina? We'll do it for $5 instead of $50 because they've set up a Bitcoin structure or their own encrypted system or whatever. And so they can do it without any transaction costs. Now, of course, in this sort of thing, it starts off that only the big players can use this kind of facility. So part of what globalization was about was financial integration. So that an automobile company where the engines are made in Sao Paulo, the tires are made in Guatemala, the hubcaps come from Texas, you know, you've got all this financing of how this is going to be worked out. But a lot of big companies can actually organize their supply chain through these kinds of techniques. And again, the transaction costs are going to be very low. And you're going to say, I want 20,000 engines from Sao Paulo by the end of the month. Ford will say. So, okay, it's all immediately paid for. It's all immediately worked out. The order goes out. They get stuck on the containers. They get stuck on the boat. They get, they're there in 2 weeks. This is something again, which is something which goes on today, which didn't go on, you know, back in the day. So the technologies and techniques of financial services have been revolutionized in the last decade or a couple of decades, really beginning around 1980 or so, and that's made a really, really big difference to how transactions can be organized and orchestrated through the financial system. I don't know if that helps answer your question a bit, but we're likely to see another round of innovation. In fact, I mentioned, well, the big guns have been doing this for some time. It's now possible for I could do it through one of these organizations that will do it to Argentina. So it is becoming democratized, if you like, and becoming available, which is actually very important for people who live on remittances, right? I mean, one of the major sources of income in a country like Ecuador is remittances from the United States. But if every remittance costs $45 as opposed to $5, this really makes a difference. And people have now worked out a remittance system that can be relatively cheap. And the same is true of, you know, for other countries where remittances are terribly important. Any other kind of questions?
I have a quick comment and then also a question, actually. So when you were saying that you were trying to kind of bring all the other chapters into today's chapter, I guess I just wanted to say that the examples that you gave and the mentions of mass were like came through clearly to me, and so I appreciated that from last week to this week we could see that relationship in this text. But a question I do have is, you've mentioned a couple times about what kind of value theory can work, and that's sort of the question here, is what kind of value theory. But I was hoping you could expand a little bit more on what you mean by that. Is that because Marx's writings weren't necessarily finished on this topic, and so we're kind of left to kind of develop a value theory, or is there maybe different schools of thought around which value theories are more apt at describing the case of interest-bearing capital? So if you could just expand on that a little bit, that'd be helpful for me, I think.
Yeah, this is this is an unanswered question, and I don't have a clear answer to it. But broadly speaking, there are two sort of worlds of thought about it. One is that the value theory might have been relevant early on when Marx was writing, but that things have become so much more sophisticated and complicated and intricate and all the rest of it, that we should recognize that instead of working with the value theory, which is, as we call it, immaterial because it's about social relations, but having objective consequences, therefore it's rather difficult to work with, and I'll talk about that a little bit today, that we should just give up on the value theory, and we should recognize that money is the representation and expression of value, and that therefore we should simply work with money and money value. And I think people who are interested in the circulation of interest-bearing capital and finance capital tend to fall very much into that way of thinking. I think you can see why, because it doesn't make sense to talk about, you know, because labor starts to disappear from the calculus in all of this. So that's one. So people are saying, well, you know, the value theory. Understand why Marx had the value theory, but a sophisticated Marxist analysis doesn't need the value theory, and therefore we can work with simply money as the measure and expression of value, and therefore work with monetary calculus. The second school of thought is that you can never do away with the value theory for a variety of reasons, because it is absolutely central to Marx's manner of theorizing. But we do have to recognize that the expression of the value theory through the monetary forms has taken us into new realms of what the value theory is about and how it works. And I'll give an example of that later in the talk that's coming. So, but this is, like I say, you know, when you go to the literature, everybody's all over the place on this. And it's mainly instinctual on my part, and rather than rationally worked out or anything, that I find it very difficult to think in terms of Marxian theory without having in the back of my mind some conception of value. The difficulty is when it gets to all this stuff about finance and credit and circulation of interest-bearing capital and so on, Marx rarely mentions value. It disappears from his discussion. And this is what I mean when I say that he hasn't taken the surface appearances that he's dealt with on those topics and brought it back into the heart of what the totality is about. I think the totality with Marx has an attachment to the value theory, has a profound attachment to the value theory, and I'll try and explain why in the talk to come. So with that, I should probably go on. Listen, is there any other pressing question anybody has? Okay, so today I have a lecture which I found it very difficult to write for the reasons that I told you. I was very much preoccupied and horrified by what I was watching on the television. But also it's very difficult stuff. And so the title of this session, session 10, is called The Return of the Rentier. Now, the figure of the rentier has a complicated history in both economic theory and economic history. For Ricardo, the rentier was anyone who simply lived passively on the rate of return upon their investments, be they in land, property, productive enterprises, government debt, interest on private loans, or the returns upon stocks and bonds. If you want confirmation of this idea, then go to Jane Austen novels. In Jane Austen novels, a good marriage prospect was someone who had an unearned income, a rent, of £10,000 a year or something like that. For Ricardo and the Manchester industrialists, such rentiers stood in the way of the full flourishing of the capitalist mode of production. They were parasites. The industrial capitalists and the Ricardian economists were desperate, says Michael Hudson, who's an economist who I'm going to rely upon quite a lot in here and has just written a rather remarkable book on a lot of this. They were desperate, he says, to free themselves from the power of a hereditary feudal landlord class and the predatory usurious finance. The usurer, says Marx, is one who would have the whole world perish of hunger and thirst, misery and want, so as to have all for himself. But by the time Marx wrote, not only had usury been largely curbed, but merchant capital, landed capital, and money finance capital had all become broadly subservient to the industrial interest, both economically and theoretically, at least within the orbit of Manchester industrialism, armed with a persuasive doctrine of the virtues of His Holiness free trade. This is the reason I often go back to the Manchester question and Manchester industrialism. For example, the monopoly power of the East India Trading Company, which had been very powerful in Britain in the 18th century, had been broken, which opened up the Indian market for the cotton magnates. The Corn Laws, tariffs on wheat, were repealed in 1846. This meant grain imports from Chicago and Odessa cheapened the cost of bread, which meant a decline in the value of labor power and therefore rising profits for the industrialists and hard times for the British landed aristocracy. Furthermore, the credit system was beginning to be systematically constructed around a combination of the reform of banking, the proliferation of joint stock companies, and the rise of increasingly regulated stock and money markets in Britain, France, and the United States. For Marx, therefore, the theoretical problem was to explain the necessary or productive roles of merchant capital, land rent, the credit system, the market for loanable capital, the bankers, the stock market, and state interventionism in an economy free of all those pesky feudal residuals. These are the questions that haunt volume 3 of Capital and crop up in the Grundrisse and theories of surplus value. But, Michael Hudson persuasively argues, the rentiers returned, bit by bit after World War I, to make increasing claims upon the surplus, to the point where even Keynes felt moved to recommend the euthanasia of the rentier, the coupon clippers as he called them, in the 1930s. Cutting a long story short, Hudson sees the neoliberal counter-revolution that occurred from the mid-1970s on as opening the floodgates to the big-time return of rentier capitalism. It is now the turn of the industrial capitalist to be rendered subservient either to the monopoly power of the merchants or to the monopoly power of the financiers, while the landed interest, including command over the minerals under the land, is extracting its ounce of flesh or grams of lithium, if you prefer, wherever it can. The financiers were the principal organizers of the deindustrialization inflicted after 1980 on the core areas of capitalism in the United States, Western Europe, and even traditional industrial districts in countries as diverse as Brazil and Argentina, India, and Japan. It's very interesting being in Mumbai. You go to a whole deindustrialized textile area, or large areas of Tokyo, deindustrialized sections. Where manufacturing industry did survive, it was in part because industrial corporations, such as General Motors and the US Steel, partially morphed into financial institutions. In Detroit, for example, the accountants displaced the engineers in management of the auto companies. When US Steel became USX, and the CEO of USX was asked what X stood for, the answer was money, not steel. Apple, for example, is a merchant capitalist organization dedicated to innovation as a business. I've spent a lot of time talking about innovation becoming a business. Innovation is a business that extracts value from countless laborers, organized back down the supply chain, that has Foxconn at its apex in production of surplus value, but Apple at its apex in appropriation of surplus value. The explanation for this return of rentier partly lies in the fact that the power of landed interests, the financiers and the merchants, may have been tamed but never abolished. Ricardo spent an inordinate amount of time working out the distinctively legitimate form of capitalist ground rent, and Marx spent an inordinate amount of time studying Ricardo on this topic. A key precondition, of course, for capitalist ground rent was the dissolution of the common property systems and the clan inheritance structures, characteristics of feudal and peasant modes of production, and the creation of individualized private property and land with all its legal trappings. The enclosure of the commons from the 17th century onwards in Britain and much of Western Europe, and the colonial imposition of private property rights to land in the Americas, Oceania, and even parts of South Asia was broadly accomplished, this task, by 1870 or so. The same thing happened much later, with the sudden privatization of the collective Maoist agriculture in China after 1978, which led in the short run to dramatic gains in agricultural productivity. The result was a not so subtle modification of how the coercive laws of competition worked. Private property and land meant the retention of a certain monopoly power of individuals as to what to do with that land. Competition in this case meant monopolistic competition, and that meant the attenuation of the coercive effects of competition, which we've often focused on in former sessions. In the 1820s, Ricardo saw that the rising demand for food grains, based upon population growth and increasing wage labor, was forcing grain production onto more and more marginal land in Britain. He theorized that the price of wheat was set by the production costs on the least favorable land that had to be brought into cultivation to satisfy the rising demand. Extra profits would thus accrue to producers on the more fertile and advantageously located land. The extraction of land rent would tax away these extra profits and put competition between all producers on a more equitable basis. This was Ricardo's theory of legitimate differential rent, the first version of which focused on natural and locational advantages, and the second on the differential impacts of investments in land improvements, such as drainage. Marx broadly accepted Ricardo's framework for handling differential rents, while adding the categories of absolute and monopoly rent, the last of which Marx observed dominated in urban areas. Now here I'm going to go off into one of my riffs about method. For those inclined to take the philosophical view, then nothing much of significance happens to human affairs that is not first worked out in the world of ideas. The marginalist revolution in economic theory in the latter half of the 19th century was a godsend. Both Ricardo and Marx accepted some version of the labor theory of value, which is difficult to work with since it is postulated as a social relation, and as such is immaterial in itself, but objective in its effects. But the other difficulty with the labor theory of value was political. It perpetually posed the question of why those responsible for the production of value, the laborers, received so very little of it. There were many in the Ricardian school bothered by the seeming injustice of it all. Many were inclined to accept some degree of redistributive socialism, culminating in John Stuart Mill's wholehearted and extremely influential embrace of this idea. The Manchester magnates and their apologists found such ideas odious in the extreme. Marx also found them wanting because Mill maintained that distribution was social and therefore amenable to human will, but that the conditions of production were natural and therefore immutable. On this last point, Marx vociferously disagreed. Now, the marginalist revolution did two things. First, it abandoned what was held to be the fuzziness of the labor theory of value for an objectified and therefore presumably much more scientifically rigorous analysis of production in terms of the combination of the basic factors of production, land, labor, and capital. Instead of social relations between capitalists, laborers, and landlords, the marginalist economists studied the production function as a combination of the inputs of land, labor, and capital as measurable and objective things. Ricardo, ironically, pioneered a way to measure the contribution of each factor of production in his theory of differential ground rent. The latter, as we saw, depended on the production cost on the least fertile soil that had to be brought into cultivation in order for supply and demand, for example, grain, to achieve equilibrium in the market. The marginalists took the principle and applied it to all the factors of production. The value of the inputs of land, labor, and capital depended upon the money value of the last unit of that factor of production that had to be added to achieve equilibrium of supply and demand. The value of the commodity rested on the combined contribution of each supposedly independent marginal factor of production. The intractable problem of how to measure K, capital, when it was partially a stock of machines, and we talked about that before, was elided. The monetary value of the inputs, therefore, depended upon their relative scarcity. This was the second great contribution of marginalist theory. If capital was scarce, then one would expect to pay more for it. Whereas if labor was superabundant, then wages would be low, which Marx insisted they were bound to be because of the production of unemployment and an industrial reserve army through the search for relative surplus value and increasing productivity of labor. The distributive shares marginalists held were a matter of objective scientific, not particular political determination. Each factor received its just price given the interplay of market forces. The marginalist solution internalized a powerful and persuasive notion of a just price, a wage, justly arrived at. All talk of redistributive socialism was sentimental waffle compared to the rigorous scientific determinations wrought by market forces. If the result was social inequality, then it was the abstract forces of the market, not human greed, that produced it. If, in its financial form, the source of all profit was conveniently masked, and if, as Marx asserted, in the financial form capital acquires its most fetishistic form, then the marginalist revolution took these properties and converted them into fanciful foundations for embracing fictitious forms of capital as by far the most adequate forms of capital. Rents, from this standpoint, really do grow magically out of the soil. Money has the magic power to beget more money, while labor gratefully accepts its scientifically determined lot of giving up its lifeblood in return for that massive pottage, otherwise referred to as a just wage. I think this explains why it is that I keep with the social relations. If you have a choice of a value theory, in this case, which rests on the relationships between a group of things, or relationships between class factions, I'm going to go with that, and that's why I stick so much with the labor theory of value, because it's about social relations, not about things. Ricardo's rationale for differential ground rent unfortunately fell apart in the latter half of the 19th century. The new transportation systems, railroads, steamships, and the telegraph, along with the abolition of tariff barriers, made accessible far more fertile lands in Eastern Europe and North and South America. These lands could easily outcompete production of food grains in Britain and Western Europe. Production was moving not onto the least fertile land, but onto more fertile land. The telegraph permitted global grain prices to be coordinated from Odessa to Chicago to Buenos Aires and Liverpool. The legitimacy of Ricardo's and Marx's differential rent theory was sorely challenged by a perpetually disappearing margin. The rationale for Marx's theory of absolute rent, which presumed that agriculture was far less capital intensive than capital in general, likewise disappeared with the industrialization of agriculture, particularly after World War II. But the private property of monopoly basis for rent extraction remained. The consequences for the land market and for land investment were wide-ranging. And while Marx concentrated on the agricultural case, rapid urbanization was shifting the emphasis of landed elites to cultivating the monopoly rents to be had from investments in land development in rapidly expanding urban areas. As late as the 1970s, the lands in Westminster and Belgravia in London, along with the prime land in other areas such as North Oxford and elsewhere around Britain, were monopolized by the aristocracy and ancient institutions such as the church, the crown, Oxford and Cambridge colleges. Properties built upon the land were often traded separately from the land. Now, examples of this exist to this day, even in the United States. You'll find this surprising, but the land beneath the iconic Chrysler building in New York is held by Cooper Union, a very old private university that specialized in training in the arts, architecture, and design fields. For many years, Cooper Union was tuition-free, but financial constraints finally led to the imposition of tuition fees. In 2018, now listen to this, the rental payment on the land under the Chrysler building, as opposed to the building itself, the rental payment on that land stood at $7.75 million. In 2019, it was raised to $32.5 million and is scheduled to rise to $41 million by 2028. Since there is no way existing tenants could or would cover these rent increases, the value of the property on the land collapsed to a reported $150 million sale in 2019, when only 10 years before an Abu Dhabi investment firm had bought into a 90% share on the building for $800 million. Cooper Union, in effect, legally robbed the Gulf investment firm of $650 million by changing the rental structure. This was rentier capitalism at work in its most blatant form. It's not as if Cooper Union produced anything apart from getting this getting all of this money. It could be said that this was a Robin Hood operation, stealing on an asset value in a good cause. But what the case depicts is the arbitrariness of rent extractions and the huge leaps that those who control access to the land can impose upon users. In most cases, this is not in a good social cause. I then talk about rising rents in New York City. I then talk about a leasehold scandal in Britain where similar sorts of things were going on. But you get the general picture. The rentier controls an asset, can charge what they like for it. These are the sorts of rentier operations on the land that have proliferated in recent times. The incredible proliferation of what are called land grabs in Africa and Latin America in particular testify to the intense competition to acquire land and resources, particularly resources like rare earth metals, so vital to contemporary electronics. At the other end of the scale, Blackstone's fabulous fortune, which we dealt with last time, derives largely from rental transactions, as do the rents increasingly extracted by the mining interests from the use of natural resources, mining, forestry, as well as agriculture, all of which supplement the monopoly rents extensively cultivated by housing and commercial urban development. The sharing or not of the increases in land value consequent upon public investments in infrastructure, for example, roads, is a much contested question. In Second Empire Paris, Haussmann originally managed to organize matters so that the public treasury captured the rising land values provoked by the building of the boulevards. That is, they took over the land and they kept it for themselves, and then they sold off the land to developers. But in the 1860s, the landlord lobby successfully turned the tables so that they retained the land rights and privately benefited from the public investment. The resultant crisis in municipal finance due to the loss of income from land sales led to Haussmann's demise in 1868. In contemporary China, municipal revenues also derive from land sales to developers. In this case, it is the development companies like Evergrande, recently in deep financial trouble, the struggle rather than the municipal government, so the finite amount of land is now causing difficulties. In today's world, rentiers are not passive, but actively engaged as speculators in asset values, such as land and property, commodities, currency, and stocks and shares. They agitate, for example, for the kind of public investments that raise their private wealth. They are market predators and draw much of their income from financial manipulations of the Soros sort. But their interests also extend to rents on a whole range of different assets, from oil rents to the growing significance of royalties and licenses on intellectual property rights. Most current rentiers are no longer passive receivers, but active interventionists who seek to channel future investments in ways that will guarantee the security of the asset values they control along with their future incomes. They actively agitate for the public investments that will add to their property values. While it is no longer appropriate to describe this class factions as passive, their income is quite properly described as unearned, in the sense that they do not make anything except a monetary profit. There are 1,000,001 outrageous examples of rentier extractions through the monopoly pricing of commodities. Here is the one I will offer. Martin Shkreli, CEO of a pharmaceutical startup company, acquired the rights to something called Daraprim, a 62-year-old drug used for protozoal infections. He promptly and scandalously raised the price per tablet in 2015 from $13.50 per tablet to $750 per tablet. When challenged, he pointed out that few, if any, users actually paid cash, and that he had cleared the price rise with the insurance companies, for whom the financial impact was negligible, given not many people used the drug. But this is the sort of thing that can, if multiplied, affect insurance premiums. Shkreli ultimately backed down some, though he insisted he needed the price rise to fund important research, quote, for the benefit of humanity. The monopoly price gouging of pharmaceutical products remains a scandal in the United States. While capitalists are supposed to adore the rough and tumble of free market competition, in practice, they prefer the quiet privilege of holding a monopoly position, and to that end go to great and extraordinary lengths to differentiate their product so as to procure a monopoly rent. Every advertisement, from toothpaste to sleeping pills to cars, emphasizes the unique qualities of the commodity for sale, sometimes even going so far as to use the monopoly price as clear evidence of the unique qualities of the shampoo in question. The cultivation of uniqueness, originality, and special qualities in the realm of cultural production now commands its own market logic of monopoly rent that sometimes seems to have as much to do with money laundering and rentier extractions as with genuine capital accumulation. Consider also the case of credit markets. Merchants had long been both recipients and dispensers of credit, and probably for this reason, Marx's brief history of the pre-capitalist trading activities merged the two functions. Long-distance trade, which often involved ventures that took a year or more, very much depended upon financial support for often collectively funded merchant ventures going on for some considerable period of time. These gave real meaning to the popular phrase, "when my ship comes in." Skills and above all, the development of relations of trust in proffering commercial credit, honoring bills of lading, ensuring risky ventures, were all on the table in the legendary coffee houses of the major trading centers. But the vast expansion of international trade that gathered pace as the 19th century wore on, particularly after 1850, when the new transport and communication systems kicked in, put major demands upon rationalizing the banking and credit system. This expansionary dynamic came to an end in 1914, and there's an interesting book by Helleiner who explains in detail effectively why over the next few decades there was very little innovation and very little growth until the neoliberal counter-revolution was consolidated under Reagan and Thatcher after 1980. From then on, as Hudson comments, the floodgates opened lopsidedly to favor a financial expansion and proliferating rentier opportunities. Keeping the level of effective demand intact in the face of wage repression for the workers was largely achieved, for example, through credit card debt expansion. The other primary function for the bankers and financiers, well, I'll skip this, is about funding government and all the rest of it and how that was done, intergovernment relations. Now, the carrying over and transformation of many practices from the pre-capitalist European world, important though it was and still is, paled into insignificance compared to the rapid expansion of distinctively capitalist credit and finance institutions from the late 18th century on. The demand for credit and interest-bearing capital emanated in the first instance, as we saw Marx arguing, from rapidly increasing investment in fixed capital, particularly of an independent and collective kind, and in the consumption fund, today including housing, autos, consumer durables. The division of the surplus between interest and return on commodity production meant that the opening up and expansion of new lines of production is likely to be credit fueled, as was the case of Amazon, which we mentioned a couple of weeks back, to the point that cash-based investment and even reinvestment is the exception rather than the rule. So what then does the credit system and the circulation of interest-bearing capital look like? This mode of circulation is very different from the circulation of the industrial capital that is value producing. The object of this circulation is to earn interest, not to produce profit. Investors place their loan capital wherever the rate of interest is higher, no matter whether it supports consumption, land acquisition and speculation, the acquisition of art objects, or loans to other banks. As capitalism becomes more complex, so the credit system plays increasingly necessary functions. It becomes a kind of central nervous system for organizing money capital flow and the general circulation of value in the midst of the turmoil of material commodity and movements. The primary social relation between capital and labor finds itself sidelined and even displaced by the complexity of debtor-creditor relational roles. Only by opening capital circulation in general to the particular processes of circulation of interest-bearing capital can the spiral form of endless accumulation be preserved. I want to make a bit more of this point, that if you're looking at exponential growth, the only way the logic and the mathematics of exponential growth can be realized is through the accumulation of the money form. The spread between interest rates on, say, German, Italian, and Greek state debt is a measure of risk premium. In 2019, some particularly secure state debt, such as that of Sweden and Germany, traded at a negative rate of interest. Depositors, in effect, paid the banks to safely store their money. Capital produces, as we have seen, increasingly massive surpluses of capital, much of it in money form, which can be saved and stored for future use by individual capitalists or simply lent out at interest. The interest rate, Marx accepts, is determined by demand and supply conditions in the money market, though in our times there is a good deal of intervention by central banks. The relation between the interest and the profit rate is tangential for all sorts of reasons. Rarely is there any equalization. Speculative markets on the futures of interest rates, currency exchange rates, commodity prices, and in stocks and shares and bonds move according to their own mysterious logics, in which something called market sentiment often prevails. Debts, however, are claims on future labor. The interest rate and the credit conditions entailed all sorts of anticipations and expectations. By the same token, debts are a vehicle to ensure future economic security. Since 1980, the portion of debt held by institutional investors, such as pension and insurance funds, has risen dramatically. they now account for about half of all investment. This generates some peculiarities. My pension fund, for example, is greater than my mortgage debt, so I am, in a sense, indebted to myself. Given the tax laws in the USA, it makes no sense to retire my mortgage debt by raiding my pension fund. The macroeconomic consequences of this can be significant. Social Security, which is pay as you go, that is, contributions by the currently employed cover the payments of current pensions, can run into demographic problems when fewer young people join the labor force at a time when more older people are retiring. Pressure then exists to convert to personal private investment pension schemes, which is wonderful for Wall Street. It opens up a vast flood of new money for investment, but exposes contributors to the risk of market collapse, taking the security out of Social Security. The Chilean case of privatizing Social Security on the advice of the Chicago boys back in the late 1970s has proven disastrous. The flow of interest-bearing capital to create surplus value is only one of its many functions. Developers may build houses with debt finance, while offering customers the debt finance required to purchase the house. In fact, the same company may finance both sides. Closed loops of this sort litter the economic landscape and frequently give rise to crises. General Motors developed General Motors Acceptance Corporation to finance car purchases. But the operation became so big and so proliferate that when crisis conditions struck in 2007, 2008, it had to become an independent bank to qualify for federal government protection. Land purchases and sales almost always depend upon adequate financing. A lot of finance flows to support consumption. This varies from housing, autos, and other large consumer durable items, as well as student debt. The strength of this demand relates to expectations on future wage levels, incomes, and salary levels of managerial status. But we know from Piketty's data that nearly 2/3 of the wealth of the top 1% in most countries is held in the form of land and real estate. Housing construction alone accounts for some 7% of GDP in the United States, double that in recent years in China. It then follows that financial operations on the land and what is on the land will also play an important role in the massification of personal wealth and power. To the degree that middle-class elements in a population somewhere have any financial savings, for example, it is more often than not embodied in home and property ownership, which is why swings in the property market are so carefully watched. But behind all of this, there may be technical shifts, maybe a tectonic shift, an epistemological break in how we should conceptualize the current state of capital and identify its core problems. Marx identified certain problems emanating from financialization clearly enough, but he never elaborated upon, let alone resolved them. To this day, this remains a gaping hole in his and our analysis. The problems begin with the partitioning of surplus value between interest and profit. For the industrial capitalist, part of what they receive is allocated as interest on the right of ownership, and the other part is profit of enterprise. The surplus value is split into return on the ownership of money capital and return on the activity of production. This implies a certain relation between the rate of monetary profit and rate of interest. If the rate of interest is high and a residual return to production after debt service and taxation low, then producers will find ways to withdraw from productive activity altogether and become passive investors. A lot of the top 1% are purely passive investors. The assertion that diverting funds to them stimulates investment and that they create jobs is totally misleading, completely wrong. At some point, the rate of profit has to rise to go beyond the rate of interest if value is to continue to be produced. The profit, Marx observes, must be large enough to allow of a part of it branching off as interest. The relation between profit and interest, he goes on to observe, is determined, and this is a very important phrasing, by the competition between the two classes arranged under these different forms of revenues. Now he's taken the two forms of revenues and he's defined class on their basis. In other words, the real difference between profit and interest exists as the difference between a moneyed class of capitalists and an industrial class of capitalists. The growth and institutionalization of this money class reestablishes the potential hegemony of money power over production activities, which industrial capital had successfully inverted during and immediately after the Industrial Revolution. Resort to the credit system, and then go on to talk about the territorial aspect of this in some detail, and I'm not going to talk about that. Credit is, of course, also a primary vehicle for centralizing capital, and as such constitutes a central nervous system dealing with the common capital of the capitalist class. The problem, however, is that the bankers and financiers frequently manipulate it to their own personal advantage rather than in the collective good. The missing of capital in money form, the massing of capital in money form, and its immense variety of uses other than funding the circulation of capital back into valorization, has become a major issue for contemporary capital to try to both control and use. Tremendous fortunes have been made in the world of finance, both legally and illegally, by such practices as money laundering, financial fraud, and tax evasion. Marx's original imaginary of capital as a vampire sucking the lifeblood out of living labor can be adapted to depict a financial vampire sucking the lifeblood out of the circulation of industrial and even merchant capital, as well as from the population at large, as credit cards, mortgage finance, car loans, and the like become integrated into the daily life of whole segments of the population, including the working class. The whole panoply of financial and monetary arrangements and institutions offer unlimited opportunities to appropriate value from others without touching valorization, without being concerned with production at all. This division of profit into interest and profit becomes perceptible, tangible, and this is now quoting Marx, as soon as a class of moneyed capitalists comes to confront a class of industrial capitalists. Moneyed capitalists and industrial capitalists can form two particular classes only because profit is capable of separating off into two branches of revenue. The two kinds of capitalists only express this fact, but the split has to be there, the separation of profit into two particular forms of revenue for two particular classes of capitalists to be able to grow up on it. The relation between profit and interest depends on competition, but this depends also on class configuration. The real difference between profit and interest exists as a difference between the moneyed class and industrial class. But in order that the two such classes may come to confront one another, their double existence presupposes a divergence within the surplus value posited by capital. This division is not a feudal residual. It is rather a consequence of the expansion and evolutionary trajectory of capital in itself. Both interest and profit express relations of capital, but interest-bearing capital stands opposite, not labor, but rather opposite profit-bearing capital. The possibility of active struggle between industrial and banking finance capitals to the exclusion and possibly the detriment of the working class then exists. I'm here heavily quoting Marx. This relationship between debtors and creditors needs to be collectively analyzed. And I then go into some of this. While every debt is also a credit, it does not follow that debts and credits are in equilibrium, any more than appeal to Say's law, in which supply creates its own demand because of every purchase as a sale, and vice versa, applies to commodity exchanges. Accumulation by financial means is far more significant than the mere economic ambitions of the bankers and the financiers, important though these may be. While investment in debt and in the credit markets constitutes a powerful force that demands its pound of flesh at some time in the future, it can also threaten to kill the host, as Michael Hobson puts it in the book for that title, and to undermine all that it purports to support. In other words, it's a center of a very serious contradiction, which we haven't really wrestled with appropriately as yet. The whole panoply of credit-debt relations becomes an ever more central feature of what endless accumulation is all about and what powers it on in the financial sphere in ways that are autonomous and independent of production capital while subsumed within the laws of motion of capital in general. Perhaps the most telling problem is the exponential growth of credit in parallel with the exponential growth of the economy in general. The total money supply to the world has been increasing at an exponential rate. The problem is that an increasing proportion of that already increasing money supply has to earn a rate of return, either interest or profit. So the amount of money functioning as capital is accelerating, And the question of where some sort of rate of return can be had moves into the center of what the financial system has to deal with. But what circulates in the financial system is not money, but monetary claims. Much of the credit issued, as Marx notes, takes the form of fictitious capital, and the easiest form of fictitious capital originates from the practice of leveraging. And then some thought on finance and credit companies. Let me go on here. We are left at the end of this with looking at systems of plunder being deployed to enhance a lot of centralized control over the mass. Within this image, there comes an image of a capitalist dystopia characterized by an ever-increasing mass of value and fictitious value, immaterial and fictitious forms of capital proliferate, reduced by less and less meaningful labor, from which an avaricious and unempathetic capitalist class, along with its hangers-on and facilitators, suck up multiple mass tokens of human wealth in monetized form. The overall circulation of capital is broken up into many circuits of capital flow, such as interbank lending or speculative exchanges of financiers and landlords in property markets. All of this bypasses valorization altogether, but which bolsters the illusory accumulation of monetary wealth in the upper classes. The circulation of the money mass as capital among the different factions, finance to merchants to landlords and back again, accelerates at speed and in quantities that astonish the rest of the population. All of this places the organization of the credit system and the circulation of interest-bearing capital, both privately and through the state, into a central rather than peripheral and accidental role in the overall circulation of capital. I'm here, as you can probably see, issuing a precursor to what I'm going to be getting into next week. The form of interest-bearing capital that is introduced into general circulation as a servant of industrial capital means to deal with the fixation of capital, differential turnover times, and circulation of fixed capital. This system emerges as a master force, a central nervous system, regulating the flows of capital in general. From that positionality, it can also build another presence in the increasing centralization of the massive capital in few hands. Most investment banks make their money out of mergers and acquisitions rather than from retail banking functions. Accelerating the centralization of the mass of capital in a few hands via the credit system animates the circulation of further and accumulation of capital. This is what is terribly important at the present time. The greater the centralization, including that through the state sector, the larger the infrastructure projects that can be undertaken, but also the larger the oligarchy becomes and the wealthier the oligarchy becomes. The accumulation of capital, as Marx once previously commented, increasingly appears as an accumulation of debt. But who holds all this debt? The danger here is forgetting that every debt is also a credit. The $86,000 everyone owes, which we talked about last week, is not owed to Martians, but to earthy creditors. While a household, corporation, or state may be a net creditor or a net debtor, as the case may be, the economy as a totality is seemingly founded on the tautological principle that every debt is a credit and every credit is a debt. But contradictory social and economic relations are internalized within this tautology. The political consequences are legion. First off, the instability and insecurity of pension funds is a mirror image of the problems of finding profitable outlets for the rising mass of accumulating capital in the future. Secondly, austerity politics rest on the proposition that debt can and must be forcibly reduced if the future is not to be foreclosed. But this is articulated without a regard for any impact upon the implications for the holders of the debt. I quote Marx now. The modern banking system robs usurious capital of its monopoly, concentrates all dormant money reserves together, and places them on a money market, while restricting the monopoly of the precious metals themselves by creating credit money. Very interesting. He goes for commodity money, has to move into credit money because that's the only way in which you can escape limits on the spiral form. From this vantage point within capital's central nervous system, Marx sees some central contradictions. The accumulation of moneyed capital simply means that money has been precipitated as loanable capital, which can be used in an infinite number of ways, in addition to that which may be used as capital. However, this accumulation can express elements that are very different from genuine accumulation, with genuine accumulation constantly expanding. This expanded accumulation of money capital can be in part its result, in part the result of elements that accompany it but are quite different from it, and possibly by elements antagonistic to it. The very fact that the accumulation of moneyed capital is augmented by elements that are independent of genuine accumulation, even if they accompany it, leads to a constant plethora of the moneyed capital. We earlier encountered the concept of a plethora of capital in considering the problems of capital's ever-increasing mass and the problems of its absorption. And here again, Marx returns to it. This plethora develops alongside the development of the credit system. Hence, there develops at the same time a need to drive the production process beyond its capitalist barriers, over trading, overproduction, and excess credit. To this, Marx hopefully adds, this must always happen, however, in forms which bring about a rebound. In our own times, it is difficult not to believe that genuine accumulation surpassed its limits sometime during the last decades, and that we are now living in a world of elements that typically accompany it, but are quite different, if not antagonistic to it, with no sign of a rebound in sight. The credit system may have originated as a faithful servant, but has now become a wayward master. To what degree and in what ways might a re-engineering of capital's central nervous system, even from the standpoint of the common capital of the capitalist class, provide an opening for constructive and creative change? Okay, it's a bit long and I didn't read all of it, but there you have it. I'm putting it on the web as is. Like I said, I have quite a few reservations. I almost certainly would revise a great deal of it, but you know, you have the fun of looking at a work in progress, and you may one of these days be able to look at the final product. Any immediate questions? Anybody has? Everybody okay? All right, so we'll see you next week. So thank you, and really appreciate you listening to me going on about this in the